Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you guys yet again for tuning in. On today's show, happy Thursday, by the way, everyone. We have another show chock full of player profiles, from everyone to wide receivers, running backs, and tight ends. It should be a very versatile and enthralling show throughout all 5 of its segments. But before we get into any of that, I do ask that you like, follow, and subscribe to the show and the network as a whole. It's a huge support and greatly appreciated by all at the network. Also, we do receive a ton of tips and donations, so if you do feel so inclined, please consider leaving them at the link gsmc.cloud. It is also a huge support to both me, my fellow podcasters, and the network as a whole. Also, if you have any burning questions, comments, or concerns about any prior segments or even segments from today's show, you can leave them at the link, and they will be answered and addressed at the beginning of the next episode. But without further ado, let's jump right into what should be a fantastical show concerning all 5 of these players. Starting off with a guy in a new home as well. We talked a lot about different receivers going to new homes, potentially finding places that best suit their style of play, and this guy I really think has a chance to really emerge as someone who fits so well into the offense he is now stepping into, and that player is Marquise Hollywood Brown. As a player throughout his career, he's been in different teams where the dynamic definitely didn't fit him. He started off in Arizona, where his speed was viewed as an asset, but he never truly became a go-to option for Kyler Murray at the nascent stages of his career. Then he moves to Baltimore, where he definitely could have been a go-to option for Lamar Jackson, as Baltimore is always seeking wide receiver help for Lamar, but he didn't establish himself, and now he goes to the Chiefs, where they definitely seem to have some stars emerging at the wide receiver position. Rashee Rice definitely stepped up as the season went on, especially in the postseason, but they could still use a little bit of extra oomph at the wide receiver position, and so they went out and acquired Marquise Brown, and they also got Xavier Worthy in the draft. So therefore, the Kansas City Chiefs now have a wide receiver core that they can fully trust, and Marquise Hollywood Brown, I believe, is going to be a true key cog in this Kansas City Chiefs machine, because I really think there are going to be 2 things that define whether or not Marquise Hollywood Brown is going to have a fantastic fantasy season. But before we get into those 2 things, let's go over some of his fantasy stats from last year. In his career, however, he has accumulated 533.4 fantasy points. His best season was in Baltimore, when in 2021 he accumulated 135.3 fantasy points. Last year, though, he only averaged 7.8 points per game. He was 61st in yards per route last year, 57th in PFF receiving grade, career low in yards, and to top it all off, he was very low in terms of PPR, 55th in PPR points per game. So as you can see, he really did not set the world afire in Baltimore, and he felt like he wanted a new fit, so he goes to Kansas City. Next year, they're projecting him to have 823 yards for 7 touchdowns for a total of 127.1 fantasy points. So those are wide receiver 2 numbers, which leads into at least one of the 2 things that truly makes Marquise Hollywood Brown a very, very key cog to how this Kansas City Chiefs offense operates. The first being, since both Marquise Hollywood Brown and Xavier Worthy are coming into the Kansas City Chiefs offense at the same time, which one is going to establish himself as a wide receiver 2? Which one is going to establish himself as the speedster, as the verticality in the Kansas City Chiefs offense? Because right now, I view Hollywood Brown as that guy, because Xavier Worthy, to me, seems like more of a gadget option who will eventually find his way into the offense, much like Tyreek Hill did when he was still in Kansas City. So it's going to be a very intriguing battle, and I think Marquise Hollywood Brown will eventually win out to become one of those either outside or slot receivers for Patrick Mahomes. What truly intrigues me is that Xavier Worthy, usually when there are very fast 40-yard dash runners in the NFL draft. Like John Ross, for example, who set the previous record before Xavier Worthy did. They never truly translate to the NFL because that's all they are. They're just speed. And Xavier Worthy, me being a Texas fan especially, is not just speed. He's a route runner. He's savvy in the red zone. In fact, the only true worry I have with Xavier Worthy is that his drop totals are very high. He did limit them last year, only 6 last year, but that is something to watch out for as Kansas City does not want a repeat of last year in terms of drops and incorporating new receivers into this offense. And so that's something as well to look out for. But that's the ultimate concern with how both, if not just Marquise Hollywood Brown, will perform in terms of fantasy. And so looking at Marquise Hollywood Brown as the second option. Let's say he is the second option because it seems as if Patrick Mahomes really gained the trust of Rashee Rice as the season progressed. And I do believe that Rashee Rice will earn that wide receiver 1 role. He's proven he's also a savvy route runner. And the fact that he was one of their best Super Bowl performers, one of the more consistent third down options as well in the Super Bowl, really makes him a focal point of this offense that can establish Patrick Mahomes' trust in someone in the skill position group. But let's say Marquise Hollywood Brown emerges as the wide receiver 2. That ultimately means he will get around 25% of the target share, considering the fact that Patrick Mahomes' targets and first reads will most likely be Kelsey, then Rice, then Hollywood Brown. And so, let's say Marquise Brown gets around 22 to 25% of the target share. That's a solid enough number where you can draft him kind of in a later round. Let's say in an 8-round draft, you can draft him around 5th to 6th round. However, let's say the situation is different. Let's say the Chiefs have a lot of red zone opportunities as they always do. And you know the Kansas City Chiefs red zone offense has so many diverse plays. The way that Andy Reid schemes them up in the red zone is special to watch, and you want a guy like Xavier Worthy in there. That begs the question of whether or not Marquise Hollywood Brown can keep up his touchdown rate, because yards are fine and dandy, receptions are fine and dandy, receiving yards are fine and dandy, especially in PPR. But the diversity in fantasy leagues means, especially in the wide receiver market, that a guy like Marquise Hollywood Brown really is going to only be coveted for something such as receptions. Because in the red zone, I definitely feel like Xavier Worthy is a bigger threat. He brings that intelligence in the red zone from Texas. He knows how to either fade out to the corner, cut inside. He knows what quarterbacks are looking for. And I think his red zone game will translate very well to the NFL. So that's another big question. Who will be the wide receiver 2 who gets the more targets, but also who will be the go-to option in the red zone outside of a guy like Rice when you want more variety in how your wide receivers operate and how they run their routes? That will truly raise certain questions surrounding Marquise Hollywood Brown as a fantasy player. But right now, I really like Marquise Hollywood Brown going in a later round and being a wide receiver 2/flex kind of option in terms of fantasy. I truly believe that where he shines is when he's in open space, and that can suit him very well because Patrick Mahomes wants that vertical threat as always. He wants that guy who can get him 30 or 40 yards instead of 6 to 10 yards. And so Marquise Hollywood Brown's open space ability and his ability to push the defense back due to his solid route running in terms of going post routes, that can truly help him. That can lead to his benefit. But the Chiefs have also proven that through their wide receivers, they can also be a very methodical offense. Sometimes you want that big play. Sometimes you want to work your way down the field. That's what they looked like they were doing in the latter stages of the postseason. They weren't necessarily pushing the ball far downfield. Patrick Mahomes is a pick-and-choose kind of quarterback. He picks and chooses when to go long. He picks and chooses when to be conservative. And that's why there's so much variance in what the Kansas City Chiefs can do with two guys in Hollywood Brown and Xavier Worthy, where one of them can certainly be that vertical threat, that deep threat that Patrick Mahomes covets in a system like this. But there's also going to need to be a guy who can separate in the red zone. And right now, Xavier Worthy is proving to be that guy. I just know that from Texas, like I said, and being a Texas football fan myself, he's not just all speed. He's a savvy route runner. He's more than a gadget option at times. He can also offer you punt return, kick return. So there definitely is a chance that Xavier Worthy may become that wide receiver 2, might slide right into that wide receiver 2 position. But what I love about Marquise Hollywood Brown is that when he makes catches, he makes them for big yardage totals. It might not go for touchdowns all the time, but he gets the yards that really catch the eye. They might not be yardage totals that immediately jump out at you, but they're yardage totals that tell the story of someone who can come off the bench on your fantasy team and get you some solid point production week in and week out, especially if Patrick Mahomes relies on him as that vertical threat, because that's what the Kansas City Chiefs think they are missing. They think they are missing a guy who doesn't just run the routes, but just goes deep, and Patrick Mahomes can trust him to catch the football. And that's all that Marquise Hollywood Brown might be required to do, and it might be a beautiful sight to see for fantasy managers everywhere. But that should just about do it for this first segment of today's show. Coming up next, we talk about another younger receiver who, after a very inconsistent rookie season, is looking to be the go-to option in Baltimore. That should give you a hint as to who it is. We'll be right back on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast to talk about that young man.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody...
Hello everyone and welcome back to this edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we get into our second segment, which should be another enthralling segment about a young wide receiver who's on the rise, I do want to remind you yet again to consider liking, following, and subscribing to the show and the network as a whole. Also, if you do feel so inclined, please consider leaving a tip or donation at the link gsmc.cloud. It's a huge support to both me, my fellow podcasters, and ultimately the network as a whole. Also, remember that you can leave any questions, comments, concerns about the show, and they will be addressed at the beginning of the next episode. But without further ado, let's jump right into another fantasy player profile for another receiver who had flashes of brilliance in his rookie season, but never truly maintained them. I truly think that he's going to become a bigger option in his sophomore season in the NFL. So without further ado, let's look more into the player profile of Zay Flowers. Zay Flowers, like I said, had some high highs last year. But as the season wore on, the pressures of being at the very least a wide receiver 1 in the Baltimore Ravens system got to him a little bit. As we saw in the latter stages of the postseason in the AFC Championship round, his fumble was a crucial turning point in that game against the Chiefs, and ultimately was one of the reasons as to why they might have lost that game. But, like I said, I truly believe that Zay Flowers has the potential, especially in a Baltimore Ravens offense that is yearning for wide receiver help, outside of tight end Mark Andrews, who can really assume the role as a guy that Lamar Jackson is not afraid to throw the ball to. So without further ado, let's jump right into why Zay Flowers can be that guy and some areas where he might need improving. His rookie season, he accumulated 129.4 fantasy points, and this is an interesting stat to know because Mark Andrews, as we all know, is very injury prone. Without Mark Andrews on the field, his first read share increased to 30%. He was 22nd in receptions. His first down route running is around 0.08 seconds. He was 33rd in receiving yards, 21st among wide receivers in target share, and 28th in terms of touchdown catches. So as you can see, had a very rocky kind of season. Not necessarily terrible, but not necessarily a rookie season to fully realize what he can become. But next year, I truly believe that fantasy projections have him around the kind of year where it's not necessarily the best sophomore year, but he's continuing to build as his career progresses. And I think that by his 4th or 5th year, Zay Flowers will be talking about as one of the top wide receivers in fantasy and in football itself. 967 yards projected for next season, 6 touchdowns for a total of 142.8 fantasy points. So a slight improvement from his rookie season. See Zay Flowers as someone you might want to take a flyer on. However, I see him as more of a streaming option, mainly for the reason that there hasn't necessarily been that many successful Baltimore wide receivers in fantasy. When you're looking at Baltimore skill position players, the first player that really catches your eye is Mark Andrews. Mark Andrews certainly is someone in that mold, as we've always talked about tight end in the show, that truly fits that old guard who still has something in them. As Mark Andrews continues to progress throughout his career, I think that Lamar Jackson is most comfortable with him as well. And not saying that Zay Flowers can become that, as Mark Andrews might get more into talks of retirement in the next couple of years. But right now, I mainly see Mark Andrews opening the pathways for different players in this Baltimore Ravens offense, not Zay Flowers at the moment. Now, when I also look at this Baltimore Ravens offense, it isn't necessarily as heavily RPO oriented as people think. Yes, there are some options to pass that Lamar does, but the Baltimore Ravens offense mainly is more comfortable orientating everything around the run. And they just went out and got Derrick Henry, who's very comfortable being that bell cow. I don't know how much longevity Derrick Henry will have in this offense, but at least for this season, he definitely offers a certain kind of outlet that the Baltimore Ravens have never had at the running back position. He's not just a guy who is looking for yards after contact. He's a guy who's going to absorb contact. He's a guy who's going to get you chunk yardage and not necessarily a guy who just explodes on the field, which I really think helps create a certain kind of tempo for this Baltimore Ravens offense. And in terms of how that will affect the wide receivers, I'm not quite certain. But let's say you have first down plays where Derrick Henry's running the ball, maybe even in screen action. That gives you a little leeway on second down to maybe get something in the short to intermediate areas of the field, and that's where Zay Flowers could make his money in terms of fantasy. He wants to improve his route running, it seems like. There's some times where he was a little inconsistent coming in and out of breaks. He was a little inconsistent in where to go, and that might have affected how Lamar Jackson's relationship with him had developed. But for now, I'll say that Zay Flowers seems to me to be the kind of guy who is going to make his money in the short to intermediate areas of the field. He can't extend Lamar Jackson's range in terms of passing. I really believe that Zay Flowers is one of those guys who can become a vertical threat, especially in terms of yards after catch ability. But that's not where I see the direction of the Baltimore Ravens offense going. Because this Henry signing really perplexes me in how they're willing to develop the complexities of this offense. And so, it really gives me pause trying to figure out how Zay Flowers is going to develop in terms of the passing game when you bring in a guy who's seemingly kind of aging out of the league and is just meant to be a bell cow who just gets you the chunk yardage. Maybe I feel like Greg Roman wants a guy that can set up the deep throw where you get the 6 to 7 yards or 5 to 6 yards that you want on a first down situation, and then you can air the ball out, and maybe that will make Zay Flowers' life a little bit easier. But for now, there's just a lot more questions surrounding A, the health, and B, the longevity of the Baltimore Ravens offense, because you can only waste Lamar Jackson's prime of his career so much by trying to implement new ways to open up different lanes for him to succeed. And right now, after one of his better passing seasons since the early stages of his career, since maybe even his rookie season, I think that the Baltimore Ravens offense right now really is not as consistent as it's been in terms of looking at different fantasy assets. Yes, I think that Mark Andrews is still going to be that guy from the skill position groups who you're going to take immediately just because, as a member of that old guard of tight ends, he's always going to be consistent no matter what. But outside of that, I really want to say that I'm confident that Zay Flowers can develop into something more than just a flex option or even someone you stream. But right now, I just can't because, like I said, it seems like there's a directionless approach in Baltimore because you had a good foundation set up last year where there were glimpses of what the passing game could be. There were glimpses of what a more passing-oriented offense revolving around Lamar Jackson could be. And what stemmed from that was really incredible to watch. It was some of the best football I've seen Baltimore play in the Lamar Jackson era, at least in the regular season, of course. But now, going out and seemingly getting a guy that will just shake up how they set up their run game and affecting the passing game more than people would think really muddies the waters of what the skill position groups in Baltimore can really do. And it's really kind of amazing to me because when I look at Baltimore, it's just Zay Flowers at the wide receiver position and then Rashad Bateman, who I really don't consider to be a guy who's going to explode himself. So many injuries in his career as well. I really think that this is going to be another transitional year, kind of a developmental year for some of these players. And I think that can lead to Zay Flowers' benefit because I think it's going to increase in target share. But the main point is, in order for the Baltimore Ravens offense to succeed, I think that all three of Flowers, Henry, and Andrews need to be healthy. And there also needs to be an innate understanding of how this dynamic is going to work. Because all three are very interesting players. Mark Andrews is an established veteran, so is Derrick Henry. Zay Flowers is an unproven product. But there is potential for this offense to do good, and Zay Flowers to be a part of it, not just another name outside of Henry, Andrews, and Jackson. Zay Flowers can have a say in this, but it'll all depend on how the Baltimore Ravens offense schemes around a different sort of running back than they've had in the past. And that should say a lot about what Zay Flowers' stock is going to look like come fantasy drafts. That'll just about do it for this segment. Coming next, we transition from wide receiver to running back as one of the most electrifying, speedy running backs in the league comes under my discussion. We'll be right back to discuss that young man after the break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free.
Hello everyone and welcome back yet again to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. I hope you guys are enjoying the show, but we're going to take a little bit of a hiatus from looking at wide receivers and transition to the running back position, because this guy is truly a fantasy enigma. His speed and abilities in the open field truly make him an option that you can't turn away from, truly tantalizing. But does that speed factor into how he might have a mighty downfall this year? And so let's just jump right into the fantasy player profile of Raheem Mostert. Now, Raheem Mostert is a really interesting running back because this is his age 33 season, if you can believe it. And in a Miami Dolphins offense that predicates itself on outpacing every single opposing defense they face, having a guy like Raheem Mostert seems to be a lot more valuable than people think, because not just having speed at the wide receiver position, but making you honest in the run game can really be an effective way to truly make the Miami Dolphins not just playoff contenders, but Super Bowl contenders. And of course, Tua has to elevate his game as well, but that's a conversation for another day. But the main caveat, the main kind of thing that's disconnecting me from truly saying that Raheem Mostert is here to stay is not just age, but the fact that he might just be too speedy. And it sounds cliche to say that, but think about the many different ways that Miami can take advantage of what they have at their disposal. They have one of the best fast receivers in NFL history, in my opinion, in Tyreek Hill. You have a solid wide receiver too in Jalen Waddle, who's a savvy route runner. And you have a quarterback in Tua Tagovailoa, who is starting to get a little bit more comfortable in this league. And so, will speed at the running back position really make you quote-unquote better, or will it just make you more appealing? And that's kind of the thing that I will try to dissect as we look over Raheem Mostert. Throughout his career, he's garnered 649.1 fantasy points. Last year, of course, was his best year. 242.7 fantasy points, and of course is the 18 touchdowns, led the league amongst all running backs, 10th in rush yards with 1,012. He was in fact the running back 4 in fantasy, so as you can see, he was high up there in terms of yards and touchdowns, so that's what resulted from it. But there are some areas where he might be a little bit more iffy than you might think. 17th in yards per touch, 6th in explosive run rate, 11th in missed tackles force. Next year, much like me, the fantasy odds are kind of cautioning people and warning people about what might happen with Raheem Mostert. 817 yards, 9 TDs, 175 receiving yards, and 2 TDs for a total of 169.4 points. So a little bit less lofty than last year. And so, I kind of want to get more into this point of being too speedy. Because the Miami Dolphins last year, their downfall really was kind of due to Tua, but it was also due to the fact that a lot of opposing defenses started to not necessarily care about how Miami beat them, and mainly started to focus in on what can we take away that really makes sense in terms of stopping what the Miami Dolphins offense can do. And that turned out to be the run game, because he placed a lot of weight onto his shoulders, and as a result, he faced a lot more pressure, and as a result, the Dolphins kind of collapsed around him. You can also chalk up the defense, but at least on the offensive side of the ball, that's what really caught my attention, because the one thing you seem to understand as an opposing defense is the fact that if you take away the run game, maybe all the pressure on Tua builds up enough for you to get home to him. And so that's why there are seemingly a kind of rift between me saying Raheem Mostert's confidently going to be in that RB1 discussion and me confidently saying that it's going to be a downfall, because the numbers jump out and stats ultimately don't lie as much as people say. But right now, I'm looking at the fantasy odds and they tell a different story. And not for nothing, but they also have Devon Achane, who had another breakout season, who I really think is the better running back. And it kind of feels weird to say because it was his rookie season last year. But in terms of what I saw on the field from Devon Achane, it was that he ran not just considering the fact that he was fast, the fact that he had power, the fact that he had explosivity, the fact that he trusted himself to gain as many yards as possible, and the fact that at such a young age, he understood his place in the Miami offense, but really made the most of it because of all the traits he brought to this offense. I'm not saying that Raheem Mostert doesn't bring the exact same traits. It's not the debate I want arising. It's the fact that Devon Achane's way of going about it may be more appealing. And he is the younger option at the position. And so, when I look at Raheem Mostert, a guy who's in his age 33 season, who predicates himself on speed, and speed alone, in an offense that dominates through speed, it just seems weird to me that people might overvalue him just because of speed. And what I look for in a running back certainly is yards, but they're important yards. You can't make your money just off of 30 to 40 yard runs. You establish yourself as a solid running back by doing both. You get the 5 to 6 to 10 yard runs, you get the 30 to 40 yard runs, and then what determines whether you're good or not is how many of those 30 or 40 yard runs go to the end zone. And Raheem Mostert definitely has the touchdowns, he definitely has the yards, but does he have the same appeal as Devon Achane? And at this moment in his career, it's difficult for me to say confidently that that's the case. Because right now, I'm looking at the Dolphins offense and wanting to see some level of consistency where Tua's comfortable throwing the football. The receivers are getting separation, not just Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle. And there's an establishment of who is going to take over the backfield. And right now, while Raheem Mostert definitely has the stats to back him up, he doesn't necessarily have A, the age, or B, the appealing kind of aura about him that says, I'm going to maintain what I just did last year. The fact that his career year came in an age 32 season is also another one of concern. I think that for what it's worth, last year I think the Dolphins got the most out of him that they're going to get. And so, who knows what the future of Raheem Mostert's really going to look like. But at this moment in time, I'm sitting back saying, do I really want to place my fantasy stock in RB1 who's not going to play as much as expected, is just going to run for running's sake and not pick a guy who can give me that balance at the position. Because right now, if I were someone who's looking at running backs, I would immediately pick up Devon Achane. I wouldn't pick up Raheem Mostert at this time. I would pick up Devon Achane because he's going to be the Dolphins starting running back, and that's what matters, the future. You have to look ahead in terms of fantasy to what the future holds. And also, he's just more savvy at the position. I know it's weird to say that about a young rookie, but Devon Achane, there just seems to be more depth to what he brings. There seems to be more nuance to what he brings, more grace notes to what he brings to the Dolphins. And balance is the word I'm really looking for, because the Miami Dolphins are just boom, boom, boom. We just want to go up and down the field at our will. Balance is what's important. And Raheem Mostert is speed, and sometimes that's good, sometimes that's enough to win you football games. But balance is what you need to sustain your offensive system, and more importantly, have it evolve. And I really think that Mike McDaniels is going to see that and be like, okay, Tua's kind of settling in. We had a little bit of success. We kind of fell apart there at the end. But I'm looking at my two running backs right now. I'm looking at my man Raheem. I'm looking at my guy Devon Achane. Raheem definitely has the production. But does he have what I want to kind of take the pressure off everything revolving around Tua and him getting the ball to his receivers accurately? And I think the answer to that is no. Raheem Mostert, for all intents and purposes, can prove me wrong, because there's a way to make a two running back system work in Miami. It just has to happen in a way that might see him not produce as many yards. But I think Devon Achane, as of right now, is more certain to be an RB1 in the near future than Raheem Mostert, and this season was kind of an anomaly for him. But that would just about do it for this segment. Make of that Raheem Mostert breakdown what you will. Coming up next, we switch back to the wide receiver position with a semi-quasi wide receiver one. We don't necessarily know yet, but he definitely is someone that I think is primed for a breakout year. Tune in to the next segment to find out exactly who I'm talking about. Be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available every...
Hello everyone and welcome back yet again to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. I hope you guys are enjoying the show thus far. We are going to continue and transition back to a wide receiver, a quote-unquote wide receiver one. Not an established one, at least in my mind just yet, but certainly has the potential to be one. And that, of course, is Michael Pittman Jr. of the Indianapolis Colts. And the reason I say semi-quasi wide receiver one is because Michael Pittman is similar to Puka Nacua, and he may be a little bit on the worse side of what Puka Nacua brings to the table. He's not necessarily savvy in one particular attribute that makes him stand out in the wide receiver fantasy market, and he's not exactly had consistency at the quarterback level either. And so breaking Michael Pittman down is certainly going to be one of the more fascinating fantasy player profiles I think you're going to get from me on the show, due to the fact that he's a wide receiver one that hasn't quite acted like it yet. So without further ado, let's jump right into Michael Pittman's curious fantasy journey. Throughout his career, he's accumulated 468.2 fantasy points. His best season was in 2021, where he accumulated 150.6 fantasy points. So, the stats from this past 3 years in terms of where he finished in terms of wide receiver fantasy projections tell the story of someone who has been inconsistent. In his first season, his rookie year, wide receiver 14. A lot of hopefulness surrounding that, a lot of optimism. Then wide receiver 21 and wide receiver 22 in the past couple of years. He was 23rd in yards per route run, 24th in first downs per route run. Hasn't had, this is a very important stat if you're a touchdown nerd and really covet your wide receivers in terms of the touchdowns they score. He hasn't had more than 6 receiving touchdowns over the last 3 years. Only scored 4 times last year despite being 4th in terms of red zone targets. That's a concerning kind of level. Furthermore, in PPR leagues, he wasn't much better, being the wide receiver 24. Another interesting stat, I was reading an article about Bill Barnwell's ranking all 32 rosters in terms of skill position talent, and reading about the Indianapolis Colts, who did place 22nd on the list, pretty low ranking. Michael Pittman Jr. ran 69% of his routes from the outside, so where you would expect a wide receiver 1 to play. He averaged 9.3 yards per catch in 2022, and he did up that total to 10.6 last season. But what Bill Barnwell brings into perspective is that there's not many players who, in multiple seasons of 80 catches or more, who fail to average 11 yards per reception. When you look at the list of players who fail to average 11 yards per reception in the wide receiver 1 range, averaging more than 80 catches per year, you have guys like tight ends. You have guys like Wes Welker and Jarvis Landry. You certainly were solid wide receivers, but not wide receiver 1 guys. Furthermore, he averaged 2.2 yards per route run a year ago, which is in line with guys like DK Metcalf and Chris Olave, like Barnwell said. But, yet again, it's kind of worrying because DK Metcalf and Chris Olave, they have good skills that prove that they can vault into wide receiver 1 territory, were the reason why people coveted them more. So right now, Michael Pittman is in that weird range where he can become a complete wide receiver, but he's just an exoskeleton of one, if that makes sense. He's not fully molded into what makes a quarterback be like, I'm going to throw to this guy on a consistent basis. Because you're definitely starting to trust him more. Maybe it's just because out wide doesn't have that sensibility of running a route, cutting inside, just getting open in whatever way he can. And that's really going to affect how people view him, especially considering the fact that Anthony Richardson hasn't had a full season of playing at the NFL level just yet. And that's really another caveat that might be worse than most of these guys who are borderline that I'm talking about when it comes to having a consistent quarterback. Because at least Marquise Brown now has Patrick Mahomes, and Zay Flowers has Lamar Jackson, who's beginning to trust himself more in the passing game. Michael Pittman has an unproven, truly untested Anthony Richardson. Yes, in the small sample size we saw of him, he did perform well. And if you took the 2 games where he fully started and inflated them, of course everyone knows he would have been the QB1 throughout an entire fantasy season. But Anthony Richardson is a truly unproven commodity who's just an interesting piece. And when he comes back, he's expecting to have someone who's going to get open for him. And I truly believe that Michael Pittman Jr., in order to become that guy, is either A, going to have to expand his route tree, or B, weirdly enough, becoming more comfortable playing in a position that's not necessarily the wide receiver 1 position. You could play in the slot where you can learn how to run more diverse routes, but in some way he has to build on being considered a wide receiver 1, but actually truly developing into one, because the Indianapolis Colts have a prime opportunity right here. They have a prime opportunity to prize the second best team in the AFC South at the moment from the Jacksonville Jaguars and truly challenge the division rivals in the Houston Texans. Because last year, shockingly enough, without Anthony Richardson for a full year, they were right there. They were a game away. They were a couple plays away even from beating the Houston Texans to the AFC South title. And that has to stand for something. You can't just sit back from that season if you're Shane Steichen, who was a new coach, mind you, going up against another new coach in D'Amico Ryans, and say, okay, this was a weird year. We're not going to perform again. You want to go all in. You want to make sure that those players from last year buy in so that when Anthony Richardson comes back, he comes into a confident locker room, because it's truly going to spell out how the Indianapolis Colts play. Because right now, Michael Pittman Jr. does not seem to me as someone who's going to elevate Anthony Richardson to new heights. And when I look at the Colts wide receiver room more deeply, they're certainly kind of set up in a way that each guy brings something different to the table. You have Michael Pittman Jr. He's going to stick out wide. He's going to be the wide receiver one. He's the share of the targets. Then you have a guy in Josh Downs who's a solid slot receiver, but it's another one of those guys who's been very inconsistent. Then you have either Alec Pierce or Adonai Mitchell from Texas, who you just drafted, at the deep threat position. And so they're trying to create levels for this offense. They're trying to create levels that Anthony Richardson can be comfortable with in terms of developing as a QB. Right now, though, wouldn't you like there to be more simple kind of ways for Anthony Richardson to move the ball? And in simplicity lies learning. And so Michael Pittman Jr., in my mind, fits the mold perfectly for someone who's going to improve. He's all set up with the intangibles and the know-how to do it. But can he is the question. Because the Colts need someone to separate away from the mindset of, okay, we're just going to have a deep guy, we're just going to have a route runner, and we're just going to have a wide receiver one. We have to change all that, because Anthony Richardson was going to want to step into a simplified system that works for him. And it's going to be a question of whether or not the Colts are comfortable with realizing that Michael Pittman Jr. is more suited to be Puka Nacua than Michael Pittman Jr., if that makes sense. Because the beauties of Puka Nacua is just that he gets open. He makes himself available in whatever ways he can. Because he himself is not a wide receiver one, but he made himself that just because he was willing to do whatever it took to move the chains, gain more yards. Michael Pittman Jr. hasn't proven that just yet. And so, if he can take that step over, if he can take that step forward, if he can realize that he's not the prototypical wide receiver one, does not fit the mold of what a wide receiver one truly is, then I think that expands what he can do in this offense. Because right now, Anthony Richardson is holding out for a hero. He's saying, I can't do this all myself. There's going to be a lot of pressure on my shoulders. And I really feel like in order for me to be consistent, in order for the Colts to be consistent as a team, I'm going to have to step into the limelight. And so, Michael Pittman Jr. is going to have to be that guy who says, hey, Anthony, I've got it. I'm learning. I'm making my way through the motions. I'm going to progress for you, and I'm going to do whatever it takes to win football games, and most importantly, to improve as a wide receiver, to really help you improve in this league as a quarterback. There needs to be some reciprocity there. There can't just be a rift between what the Colts consider to be their wide receiver one and their young, unproven quarterback. There needs to be an establishment of what Michael Pittman Jr. is going to do and what Anthony Richardson is going to do in order to make the Colts offense truly special. But let's just about do it for this segment. Coming up for our last segment, we switch from the wide receiver position to yet another tight end. A tight end who I truly believe can be in the tight end one conversation, but is always kind of sneakily going under the radar. We'll be right back to discuss him on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast as our last segment for the day. Hello everyone and welcome to today's last segment on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. We're going to come to you with a very nice little last segment to conclude the week with a nice little redemption story of a tight end who, after leaving the New York Giants, sorry New York Giants fans, you might want to cover your ears for this particular segment, and moving to Jacksonville, he truly has gained comfortability in a system that really appreciates him for his route running. And I truly believe this guy's going to be in contention for the tight end 1 position for years to come. But a lot of people are continuing to forget about him. So let's go over the fantasy player profile of Mr. Evan Engram. 1 second as I switch this graphic. Now, Evan Engram, like I said, had a very hard start to his career in New York. Maybe it's the whole media circus, as it always is in a New York atmosphere. But whatever happened in New York, he truly dispelled and disproved when he went to Jacksonville and said, hey, I actually am a very good tight end, and has quickly turned into one of the top tight ends in this league right now. And he's one of those guys who really kind of melds both of those eras of tight ends together. He's kind of the bridge between both of these groups, because he's not necessarily the youngest of tight ends, but he's not necessarily old enough to be Travis Kelce or George Kittle. So right now, Evan Engram is like the guy you might want to covet at the tight end position. But funnily enough, I don't think enough people talk about him as a tight end 1. But looking at the stats, they prove it themselves, so let's go over them. Throughout his career, he's accumulated 611 fantasy points. Last year was his best year, 116.3 fantasy points. And the tight end 6 in 2022 in terms of PPR as well, and the tight end 2 last year. Another interesting statistic you might want to know is that in terms of catches, he had 114, and it beat his previous career high by 41. So he's increasing his production at an astounding rate. And if you're a PPR nerd like myself, then you should consider that kind of production at the tight end position, because it doesn't get any better than that. Career high 963 receiving yards, although there was a career low in yards per catch, maybe because, as we all know, the Jaguars' offense kind of stagnated towards the end of the year, and nothing was really working, and Trevor Lawrence was just trying his best to get to Evan Engram, but it didn't really work out. But to kind of sum up why Evan Engram is such a special player: 4 games with double-digit receptions, 8 games with 7 or more receptions. So overall, he is one of those guys who really needs to be in the conversation. Not just the Sam Laportas, Travis Kelce's of the world. Evan Engram needs to be in the discussion. Next year, the fantasy projections aren't as good as people might think. 802 for 4 touchdowns, 102.7 fantasy points. And that's a little bit low, I think, in my opinion. Because we're going to talk about this a little bit in this segment. I think the Jacksonville Jaguars offense are kind of a mirage. They're being viewed through rose-colored glasses as a lot of potential. But I think that in terms of the wide receiver room, they're all too focused and similar in same categories. And so without further ado, let's jump right into why I think Evan Engram is going to be more than just undervalued. He truly is going to be in the conversation for the tight end 1 position. So, as we all know, this is a very pivotal year for Trevor Lawrence. He could earn a lot of money. He's looking for a very big contract, wants to be one of the highest paid kind of third-year, fourth-year quarterbacks in the league. He's seeing that Tua is getting a long extension, so he's like, hey, why not me? And he really wants to establish himself. But when I look at the skill position talent around him and what he has at disposal, I see 3 guys that are really too similar to kind of differentiate themselves and stand out in their own unique ways. I look at Christian Kirk, who's perhaps going to be the wide receiver 1 next year. I don't really know. And all I see from Christian Kirk is speed. I don't necessarily see contested catch ability. I don't necessarily see savvy route running. I definitely don't see a guy who is very varied in what he does. And I think that leads to the detriment of what Trevor Lawrence is allowed to do. Furthermore, you acquire two guys, Gabe Davis from Buffalo and Brian Thomas Jr. from the draft, who are also known for this skill. Perhaps Gabe Davis is more of a solid route runner, but like I said, in that system last year where, Stephon Diggs kind of got frustrated, he had to become the deep threat, and I feel like he's become more comfortable getting that level of verticality that an offense would want. Maybe that's why Jacksonville drafted him, but still, Christian Kirk and Gabe Davis are still similar because they both want to get down the field. Christian Kirk through speed, Gabe Davis just because he wants to get in that verticality and he's more familiar with it. And then last but not least, when I look at Brian Thomas Jr., I look at another guy who was more known for his going post routes and being explosive than, just running routes. And coming out of LSU, which was a very exciting offense to watch, I don't think he's really keen to the understanding that football is more about the simple things and the detailed things. And so that leads to the unsung hero of this Jaguar skill position group. New York Giants fans yet again, cover your ears, but Evan Engram. Evan Engram, when you think about it, is really the Jaguars' best route runner. He's the guy who's like, okay, I see Christians going up this way. He is not necessarily, cutting inside, fooling receivers, wanting to make moves to get open. Then who knows what Gabe Davis and Brian Thomas Jr. are going to bring to this offense. Maybe they'll add some variety, but at the current moment, I really don't think so. And then it falls in Evan Engram's lap to be like, hey, where's the variations? Where's the diversity in route trees? And where's the complexity to our offense? Because right now, the Jacksonville Jaguars are falling down a slippery slope in the AFC South. Houston is here to stay. Indy is a question, but a very solid question because Anthony Richardson certainly looks like, from the small amount of games we saw him in, like he's here to stay. Where is Jacksonville without route runners? Because in the AFC, right, it seems to me like teams definitely covet speed as one of those skills that you want in a wide receiver. But they're also realizing that you can't necessarily get certain traits from just one person. That's why they're going out. This, from Jacksonville, while I like Gabe Davis as a receiver, and while I think Brian Thomas Jr. is certainly one of the more underrated wide receivers from this draft class, I don't necessarily think they'll help Trevor Lawrence, because Trevor Lawrence just wants a guy who's always open. And I know it's kind of cliche, kind of a through line with all of these wide receiver, tight end related player profiles, but it's true. If I were a quarterback in the NFL, I would just want a guy to get open. I wouldn't want a guy who's just going to run down the field. What does that say about my arm strength? I might get called into question because I can't get it to that guy, when in reality, I just want guys who can run that route, but also can be like, hey, I see that this defender may be playing me a bit deeper, I'm going to cut inside. And so, that's why I think Evan Engram is really being underestimated in this tight end market, because you really have guys in much better offenses, especially guys like Sam Laporta and Travis Kelce, who are very valued, but still could prove to decline, because on one end of the spectrum, we don't necessarily know what to make of Sam Laporta's rookie season, because who knows if he's going to sustain that throughout an entire NFL career. And Travis Kelce is already showing signs of decline. And so someone has to bridge that gap in the tight end fantasy market, so why not Evan Engram? And, to sum it all up, I really think that stressing the tight end position is going to be a very kind of muddying thought for fantasy managers everywhere. I don't want you to get in your mind that you have to get a tight end. I'm just saying that expand your palette. in terms of the tight end position. Because you know that Sam Laporta and Travis Kelce are going to go higher than they should. And so you have to get out of the mindset of, I have to go for a top-end guy. I have to go for a Travis. I have to go for a Mark Andrews. I have to go for a George Kittle. You can find a guy in the median like Evan Engram and all be set. And that's something you have to really value, because if you don't, then Evan Engram might go and he might have a fantastic season, and that will be that for you. So the importance of understanding your fantasy markets is what will separate you from other players, because I can just sit here and give you these fantasy profiles. It's really up to you to understand the mindset that I'm presenting them from. And that is all I have to say on that. But that should just about do it for today's show. Please consider liking, following, subscribing to the show. It's a huge support to both me, my fellow podcasters, and the network as a whole. Consider leaving a tip or donation at the link gsmc.cloud. Is a huge support as well to me, my fellow podcasters, and the network as a whole. Anything you leave is greatly appreciated. I have been Chris Shepard. This has been the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. We'll be back and better than ever to close out the week tomorrow on this show. Thank you guys yet again for tuning in.